Hello everyone, and welcome to eResources Librarianship for Beginners. My name is Joe Marciniak, and I'm the Assistant Director of Electronic Resources Management and Strategies for Princeton University Library. This session is intended for new eResources librarians as well as experienced librarians interested in making a change in their career path. My goal today is to present topics and content in a way that can be understood and used by beginners and new eResources librarians. While we'll be covering the entire eResources lifecycle, my aim is to provide information that will allow you to identify specific areas for further independent investigation. I will also provide resources and document templates that you can refer to after this session. Your goal is to understand the eResources lifecycle and the role you will play in that lifecycle as an eResources librarian. Please jot down any questions you have for our discussion following the presentation video. I also hope to provide useful advice, questions, and considerations for when you are reviewing job descriptions or going through the interview hiring process. The information provided in this presentation has been shaped by my experiences as an eResources librarian for the past 12 years. To give you a brief overview, here are some data points from my current institution as well as two of the previous institutions I worked for. All three are academic institutions, and while they have different mission statements, goals, and budgets, the eResources lifecycle remains the same. Here's a quick look at the agenda for today. The eResources lifecycle, collection development, managing access issues, license negotiations, payment and technical setup, maintenance and renewals, and job profiles and interviews. This is a useful image of the eResources lifecycle. As you can see, the eResources lifecycle never actually ends because the last stage is evaluate and monitor, which is an ongoing process, especially with eResources subscriptions, which continue indefinitely. My supervisor teases me because I like to reference an image that's almost 15 years old, but I've found that it has stood the test of time. There have been developments, of course, primarily to some of the detailed parts, such as how we provide access or how we evaluate a product, but the 5 main steps highlighted here in purple remain unchanged: acquire, provide access, administer, provide support, and evaluate and monitor. No matter which institution you work for, all of these stages will need to be addressed. The main difference is how each institution navigates these steps and the staff they have to support them. This image of the eResources lifecycle can be found in the NASIG document, Core Competencies for Electronic Resources Librarians, which I recommend as a good overview of the areas you will be expected to be knowledgeable of in this profession. It's been 3 years since the last revision, but it's still a relevant and useful document. The lifecycle diagram can basically be used as a checklist of job duties or to populate more complex project management software with the steps you need to tend to. In fact, one of the biggest challenges for eResources librarians is managing such a complex lifecycle for many eResources simultaneously that often involves several different departments and staff members. Coordination is a big part of the eResources job duties, so staying organized is a key skill. As I mentioned previously, while the life cycle remains the same, how you accomplish those necessary steps can be drastically different depending on the institution or organization that you work for. In fact, as the eResources librarian, you might be responsible for designing and/or updating those acquisitions workflows. One of the aspects you will want to focus on when considering an eResources position is how many people are involved in supporting the eResources lifecycle at your prospective institution. What is the volume of acquisition? Are there already guidelines and policies in place? If you work at an institution with a high volume of acquisition, but a smaller staff, you will be very busy. But you will also have more control over the life cycle and the workflows for accomplishing your goals. So it's just a question of the type of work environment you enjoy and thrive in. For example, if we zoom in on just the acquire stage of the life cycle and notate all of the stakeholders involved in this step, you can see how much of your work will actually be coordinating workflows with other departments and staff members. At my current institution, we have many selectors or subject experts or library liaisons, so they are heavily involved in the assess need/budget stage. If you work for a smaller institution or just one with fewer selectors, you might play a larger role in assessing the need of potential eResources acquisitions. So again, consider the type of role that you want to play in the acquisitions lifecycle and use that to evaluate potential institutions for employment. Many of the other life cycle stages will look the same when you list the stakeholders. So while technical knowledge of systems and tools is important, such as your knowledge of your LSP, authentication configurations, etc., your ability to solve problems, stay organized, learn independently, and communicate clearly and succinctly with others will be the skills that you use on a daily basis, and they will have the most impact on how successful you are in completing your job duties. At the end of the day, you'll likely be the only one looking at this process from this level. So it's your responsibility to make sure the acquisition moves through each of these stages smoothly and quickly. You might be the only e-resources librarian, but that doesn't mean that all e-resources decisions should be your responsibility. Unless you're an expert in all disciplines, you will need help evaluating the content of each database or package that you are considering. If you work at an institution that does not have many selectors, you will need to look elsewhere for help evaluating new e-resources offers and opportunities. You can use your vendor account managers to help with overlap analysis. I used to do this all the time with Excel spreadsheets myself, but then I started looping in our account managers more and more in this process. You can subscribe to e-resources listservs and also read reviews of new e-resources that are coming to the market. You can also form a collection development committee almost anywhere that you are. People are usually very happy to serve if you set up a system where they rotate off after a year or two, and then you won't have any problem getting members. Plus, everyone gets to be heard and share the responsibility of evaluating content. When forming a collection development committee, be sure to assess the credentials of all library personnel. At a previous institution, we had a staff member who had a master's degree in history, and they had been overlooked when forming the collection development committee. So consider staff, administration, as well as other librarians for the committee. ILL and resource sharing personnel are also very important and valuable to a collection development committee. They bring a unique perspective because they know exactly what users at that institution have been requesting access to. Ebook collection development is unique because there are a few options that can help you manage your budget and ensure that you acquire content that will be used by your patrons. The patron-driven acquisition model, or PDA, allows patrons to trigger purchases on your behalf based on certain parameters you previously established with the provider. So here, you're getting the patron interest coupled with the decisions that your collection development committee has made in terms of which kinds of resources you want to acquire. The evidence-based acquisition model, or EBA, is a little bit different. Typically, a publisher or vendor will open an entire front list or title list of ebooks to your patrons, and they will have access to all of those ebooks for a set period of time, such as a calendar year. At the end of the year, you will then choose which titles to apply your funding to for permanent acquisition. Now, the total amount you agree to pay the vendor will be a previously negotiated amount, such as $10,000. So this is a useful model because patrons have access to a larger pool of titles during the subscription period or the agreed upon period. And then you only purchase content that was actually used by your patrons. But you can also decline to purchase specific titles even if they were used because you have a knowledge of your larger collection development goals and you might decide that a title does not fit within those goals. Sometimes also you will agree with the publisher or the provider on a certain amount of usage points or triggers on an ebook before it has to be included in your year-end purchase. For example, if it's accessed maybe more than 5 times, it will automatically become a part of the perpetual access titles that you need to purchase at the end of that given year. Streaming video acquisitions can be a little bit complicated. There are some major vendors such as Canopy, Avon, Swank Digital Library, Film Platform, Films on Demand, and DocuSeek. But there are also many streaming videos out there that your selectors or that your patrons will want to have access to that are not represented by one of these major companies. In those cases, you might find yourself working directly with independent filmmakers to license and acquire streaming video content. This is actually an area of growth that we've really seen in library e-resources, and it is a little bit more detailed because you're not working with established vendors or established companies. You actually have to work directly with independent filmmakers, and so it requires a lot more work honestly, because what you're normally going to have to do is you might have to draft the license agreement for the filmmaker. You might have to be more heavily involved with the payment and the invoicing process. And you'll also have to facilitate secure delivery of those video files, ensure that they meet certain technical specifications, and then you'll have to partner with a third party to host those streaming videos to provide access to your patrons, unless you have the ability to self-host, in which case you will now have a new internal workflow with your colleagues at your institution for hosting that content and making sure that it's available to patrons. So it's an exciting area of collection development for e-resources. It really brings unique content to your patrons and to your users, and sometimes those streaming videos aren't available any other way to your patrons, but it's a little bit more time intensive and it's a little bit more detailed, and you're going to be involved in more aspects of the e-resources lifecycle than other ones that are from previously established vendors. But it is an area that I've seen a lot of growth in, so it's something to pay attention to and to take note of. So if your subject experts are weighing in on the quality of the content, what should you focus on? You'll want to pay attention to the overlap of current e-resources with new considerations. For example, if you're purchasing a large ebook package, you'll want to compare the title list to your current holdings in your LSP or ILS or your catalog. Overlap will always be a factor in large libraries, and the amount of acceptable overlap will vary depending on the library you work for. For journals, you can find a journal's impact factor in tools like Scopus or Web of Science. The impact factor tells you how often articles are cited by other authors within that publication, so it gives you a sense of how often a journal's articles are used within the discipline, which is a valuable point of view to bring when considering journal titles and large journal collections. Embargoes are another important aspect of collection development. An embargo is a period of time which your patrons will not have access to specific content. So ensuring that there are no embargoes on content ensures seamless access for your patrons. And if there are embargoes on some content, be sure to communicate them to stakeholders and display the information to your patrons clearly in your library's catalog. You'll also want to learn as much as you can about your institution's curriculum. The more you know about when and what departments teach, the better. One of my previous institutions was very small, so they only offered the chemistry senior seminar course every other year instead of every single year. So when I looked at usage statistics for ACS content, that's American Chemical Society, it looked like we should cancel our subscription. But after meeting with the department, I learned more about the curriculum, which explained the usage trends that I was seeing. In addition to those aspects, you'll also want to focus on the UX or the user experience of interacting with an e-resource. Is it user-friendly? How will your patrons navigate the e-resource? Do they need to create a personal account to access all of the content? Many e-resources are very behind in ADA compliance, so it's also your job to advocate for all patrons' ability to use every e-resource. Access issues are common with e-resources for a variety of reasons. Vendors make changes to platforms, content, and links. Users have very different skill levels when it comes to navigating e-resources, configuring browser settings, and using library tools. E-resources are a living format even if perpetual access has been purchased, so disruptions in access are always possible. You will want to ensure that you have a system in place for users to report access issues and error messages and to receive prompt help. My current institution uses the SpringShare product LibAnswers, which allows us to claim and respond to user reports about access issues. The system also allows us to tag or classify tickets so we can analyze them later to see if any trends are emerging. Discovering trends will allow us to proactively address access issues rather than reacting to user reports. So even something as simple as a Google form will help you track access issues and reply quickly to patrons. You will also want to ensure that users can easily discover the appropriate way to report access issues. Some libraries have dedicated personnel just to process license agreements, but at many institutions, the responsibility of processing license agreements falls to the e-resources librarian simply because license agreements accompany e-resources purchases and subscriptions, so they become a part of the e-resources lifecycle and management workflow. License agreements can vary in length and complexity. Some license agreements are just 1 or 2 pages, while others are over 30 pages with tiny font that you will have to enlarge just to be able to read. But one helpful aspect of the license agreement is actually its structure. Like scholarly articles, license agreements are tightly organized, and each section has a heading that provides the context for the information in the following clause. License agreements can certainly vary, but the most common structure you will encounter contains a glossary or definitions of terms, sections about authorized users and authorized uses, prohibited uses, a statement about ownership, information about access and authentication, fees and payment terms, licensee and licensor obligations, and warranties and indemnities. And there's usually a section at the end that's labeled general or miscellaneous. Other than the permitted uses clause, the authorized users clause is the most important from the service perspective of the e-resources librarian. It's an important clause because it defines the users who can legally access and use the content. As librarians, we advocate for the broadest, most inclusive definition of authorized users possible. You will typically see an AU clause reference current faculty, students, and staff, but what about visiting researchers, contractors, alumni, and walk-in patrons and community users? These are all groups that we want to see represented in a license agreement. One of the points of negotiation with a provider can be to expand the definitions of authorized users to make sure your entire user population has access. Most e-resources librarians do not manage a budget themselves, but they do work closely with those who do manage budgets. Typically, a library will have multiple fund managers, such as selectors, or there will be a general acquisitions fund that is managed by an assistant or associate university librarian or the head of acquisitions. Your job with budget management will be to provide estimates of what is needed yearly to maintain access to all of your e-resources subscriptions, as well as to those hosting and maintenance fees that accompany some perpetual access acquisitions. E-resources subscriptions typically increase every year between 3 and 5%. So if your budget is flat, you will actually need to cancel some e-resources subscriptions eventually. It's important to ensure that your managers and supervisors realize this. A flat budget actually means that you will have to reduce your spend each year, and that means you will reduce the number of subscriptions and content you will be able to provide your researchers and patrons. During the COVID pandemic, many e-resources subscription costs did not increase. They were flat. But since the pandemic, we have seen more drastic increases ranging from 9 to 20%. This will be an important metric for you to track and to discuss with your colleagues and funders. Some institutions also have endowed funds as well as general funds. Endowed funds are funds that are earmarked for specific types of purchases, so they cannot be used for every e-resource. It will be up to the fund manager to make the case for why endowed funds should be used for specific types of e-resources. Endowed funds usually specify the type of content that can be purchased, but not the format. You will also provide general guidance regarding collection development. For example, if your library has purchased the ebook front list from a specific publisher every year for the past 10 years, it would be a good idea to continue that practice. So although you are not a subject matter expert in all the disciplines represented in those ebooks, you can still recommend the purchase based on collection development principles of continuity and comprehensive coverage of a publisher's content. It's reasonable to assume that your patrons will expect continued access to that publisher's front list of ebooks. Going back to the e-resources lifecycle diagram, the second stage is provide access, which is the most important part from the usage service perspective of the e-resources librarian's job duties. What's the point of all of this if users cannot locate and use this content in their teaching, research, and academic publishing? In most cases, access to e-resources is provided simply by a link from the vendor. So once you have a working link, think about all the access points for the patrons, such as your library's catalog, the A to Z list, and LibGuides. Work with selectors and reference staff to understand how users discover and locate library e-resources. Can you push holdings information to Google Scholar? Should you advertise new e-resources? And if so, where and how? If your institution has a communications department, you might consider using their expertise and tools to advertise new e-resources that have broad appeal, such as subscriptions to major newspapers, language learning platforms, and ancestry research resources. A big part of providing access is actually authentication, both on and off campus. The methods by which users are authenticated at your institution will need to be incorporated into library systems to ensure access to e-resources aligns with institution affiliations. After all, it's the institution that decides a person's affiliation, not the library. Whether or not someone meets the criteria to be considered a student, faculty member, or staff member is up to the institution to decide. Then, the library ensures that those approved affiliations have access to e-resources. The most common method of off-campus access and authentication is EasyProxy. EasyProxy has been around for a long time, and it basically makes users appear to be on campus no matter where they are actually located. EasyProxy is based on IP ranges that are assigned to your institution. You provide the vendors with your institution's IP ranges, configure EasyProxy with the vendor information, and then users can quickly access e-resources from off-campus. And we'll take a look at an example of an EasyProxy configuration in a moment. In addition to EasyProxy IP authentication, there is also SSO, or single sign-on authentication, such as OpenAthens. SSO allows users to access e-resources both on and off campus independently of IP information. Access is not based on location at all, but rather a person's attributes. Attributes are pieces of information about a user, such as this is a faculty member or a student. SSO authentication is becoming more popular, especially as we see the development of more sophisticated e-resources that require additional user information to function. While SSO is popular with many vendors, keep in mind that it is important to continue supporting simpler methods of authentication such as IP authentication, because SSO requires vendors to have more advanced technology support, and many vendors cannot support SSO. Finally, there's VPN access authentication. VPN stands for Virtual Private Network, and VPNs are typically managed by an institution's IT department, not a library IT department. VPNs provide an on-campus experience for the users, and they can seamlessly access e-resources off-campus as if they were sitting in the library. But some VPNs are now masking IP addresses to the outside world, so these VPNs are not able to provide users with access to e-resources. It's just something to be aware of. Not all VPNs are the same, and you need to discuss their capabilities with your IT department. I mentioned that we would take a closer look at EasyProxy configuration. You can view examples of EasyProxy stanzas on OCLC's website, which lists vendor EasyProxy stanzas in alphabetical order. Vendors submit these stanzas to OCLC to host on their website, so they are typically created by the vendor or publisher. Here's an example of the ACS, American Chemical Society EasyProxy stanza. Vendors often update their stanzas as they launch new products and platforms, so be sure to check back for updated stanzas to add to your local configuration. But not all vendors are able to provide EasyProxy stanzas. In those cases, you will need to create a stanza internally. You can create and test stanzas yourself, or include your IT contacts to help you craft and test stanzas. Once you have a working stanza, you are able to provide off-campus access to your users. On the right side here, you can see an example of a very simple EasyProxy stanza, but these will only work with simple websites and platforms. Typically, the more complex the functionality of the website, the more complex the stanza needs to be. As an e-resources librarian, you will be responsible for knowing your institution's ILS or LSP. ILS stands for Integrated Library System, and LSP stands for Library Services Platform. The difference is typically that an LSP is more inclusive of all library operations and departments. It's not just for e-resources, so it allows all personnel to utilize different modules and features to complete and manage job duties within the same platform. When considering e-resources positions, it's important to note which ILS or LSP your prospective employer uses, and then to learn as much as you can about that system. Some providers offer detailed information about their LSP for free online, so you can learn quite a bit about it without having an actual subscription or access to the software. You will want to ensure that you are reviewing current content though, and it's not dated information that might have changed since it was created. Sometimes a lot of this content seems to live a long time online. How a library assesses the value of an e-resources subscription can vary. All e-resources librarians should regularly review usage statistics and communicate usage trends to stakeholders. They should also be familiar with a CPU analysis, or a cost per use analysis, which describes usage in terms of a monetary value. To do this, e-resources librarians use counter usage statistics. Counter stands for Counting Online Usage of Networked Electronic Resources, and it's useful because it's a standard. Before Counter, usage statistics were provided by vendors, and there was no way to ensure that all vendors were using the same metrics when reporting usage, or the same user behavior when reporting a certain metric. So, Counter provides an apples-to-apples comparison of how user behavior can be quantified. Calculating the CPU is simple. You just need the total paid for an e-resource and the desired counter metric. There are several counter metrics. For example, if you pay $100 per year for an e-journal subscription and you'd like to calculate the CPU for full text article requests, you simply need to run the counter usage report for JR1. The JR1 metric is the total number of successful full text article requests. Then you can divide the cost of the subscription by the number of full text requests. If you had 200 article requests, your CPU would be 50 cents. Usage stats are a useful tool when evaluating the value of a resource, but they should be combined with selector and patron feedback to form a more complete conclusion about a subscription's value. You would never want to cancel a subscription without identifying all of the users and stakeholders and meeting with them to discuss the potential cancellation. When assessing journal packages, it's useful to look at which percentage of the journal titles account for most of the use. This is an example of full text article requests from a large eJournals package. You can see that of the 2,517 eJournals, only 108 had more than 20 full text article requests, while nearly 1,600 of the eJournal titles had 0 full text article requests. If this were an expensive package, you could then potentially explore subscribing to those 108 eJournals directly and canceling the package. It's unlikely that direct subscriptions would be a better deal than the entire package subscription, but you might perform an analysis like this one and discover that only, say, 5 eJournals account for most of the usage. In that case, it might be cheaper to move to direct subscriptions over the package subscription. It's just another way to look at usage when titles are part of a larger package subscription rather than direct or individual subscriptions. Most academic libraries have several positions responsible for working with e-resources. There is a lack of standardization in position names and where positions are located within libraries, so you will need to read job postings carefully and craft interview questions to gain a greater understanding of the full scope of the position that is being advertised, as well as the personnel you will work with. Since e-resources librarians collaborate with many other departments and personnel, try to learn more about those relationships at prospective institutions. Have those relationships already been established, or will that be one of your new responsibilities? Ask the hiring committee for details about existing workflows for acquiring new electronic resources. Are the workflows in place and documented? Are there guidelines and policies surrounding e-resources acquisitions? Is there a library IT department, or will you be required to work with the institution's IT department to configure and support e-resources access? Does the library have its own finance and billing personnel, or will you be working with external departments to process and pay invoices? Take a look at the staff directory for personnel with electronic resources or systems or technology in their job descriptions. Ask about the process of negotiating license agreements and who has the authority at the library to sign license agreements. Will your position be empowered to negotiate and sign license agreements? Ask questions about the e-resources systems and tools in place, the LSP or the ILS, Easy Proxy, SSO configuration, VPNs, and any other tools that facilitate access to electronic resources. Who manages those now, and who will be expected to manage them in the future? How does the library communicate new e-resources and access issues with patrons? Are you able to edit the library's webpage? Is there a communications department? How many selectors would the position work with on e-resources acquisitions? Finally, you'll want to ask about the volume of new e-resources acquisitions and the volume of support tickets and questions received by the library. Since you will ultimately be responsible for both, this will give you a good idea of the workload. which is why it's also important to learn about the other library personnel you will be collaborating with on those workflows. If you're still awake, then eResources Librarianship might be for you. We should have about 10 minutes left for discussion, so feel free to ask any questions you might have. I'm also available via email if you think of questions at a later date. Thank you very much for attending my session.